Check, 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 check. This was left on all night, so I don't know if that runs the battery down. But...
No, that should be fine.
Okay.
Check 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, check, check.
Check.
That's exactly what I gave her one sentence.
Check, check.
Lynn, hold. You got that right about this is good here. So this needs to come down. If we can hold right there, tape it right there. Thank you. That was a good mix, yes, last night. That was a nice sound. Thank you. Yeah.
You know, so Tom, I'm angling a little bit this way because there's
People over there.
Yes.
Okay.
Sweet Studio, Bill Geimer. Well, I'll be at the table after this today. Where do you live in BC? Oh.
That's right.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, let's see. Okay. Yeah.
You know how old the Voice of Women is?
Yes, started with this.
Apparently, months ago, we said we would start with one
I'm
song.
on the board. I know.
Yeah. My mother used to belong to that.
Oh, really? What's your mom's name?
Jean Harder. It's been a long time ago. She's passed on 30 years ago.
Oh, really? Oh, really? Oh,
She's an 18 woman.
Hello. If you're talking, you can't hear the music and sing along.
Last night I had the strangest dream I never dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war. I dreamed I saw a mighty room filled they'd never fight again. And when the paper was all signed and a million copies made, they all joined hands and bowed their heads, and grateful prayers were prayed. And the people in the streets below were dancing round and round, while swords and guns and uniforms were scattered on the ground. Last night I had the strangest dream I never dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lynn Adamson, and I'm your moderator for this session. I'm a co-chair of Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, and we're very happy to be co-sponsors and help in the organizing of the conference today. So welcome, everyone, and who's here to change the world? Woo, let's do it. There's not a lot we can do about the past, but together we can change the future and make it the future we want it to be. And we're going to start this morning with a fabulous plenary session on Canadian weapons, wars, and Indigenous rights. So we will have 3 speakers this morning. We'll be starting with Bill Geimer, then Tamara Lorincz, and Lee Maracle, and I'll introduce them as we go, but the introductions will be brief because you have the information in the program as well. So Bill, I'd like to invite you to come up now. Bill Geimer wears his 82nd Airborne U.S. Army uniform at events like this in remembrance of his good friend, Captain Gordon O. Walsh, who died for absolutely nothing in Vietnam in 1969. So would you welcome Bill Geimer, please?
Thank you and good morning. I bring greetings from the Vancouver Island Peace and Disarmament Network. We're happy to join you. And I certainly want to thank Ontario for giving us a great example of electoral process. We are, in British Columbia, we are having a referendum on proportional representation in about a month. And folks in Ontario have shown us what the first past the post system can yield. Doug Ford. So we're very grateful to Ontario for that example. Lynn has explained why I wear what I'm wearing today. And my other motive in the work that I've done since becoming a Canadian is a concern with civilian deaths in combat and in conflicts. And when I traveled Canada last year, preaching like the Baptist preacher that I once thought I wanted to be back in the States about my book, Canada, The Case for Staying Out of Other People's Wars. And by the way, I was delighted. I don't know if you heard Christine on last night. She was just fantastic. And I was happy to learn that the Korea chapter in the book is correct, and she summarized it beautifully last night. But I traveled the country promoting my book and preaching a 2-part message. And part 1 of that message is that the story of all of Canada's wars, from 1899 to now in the Middle East and in Mali and Iraq, is the story of fighting other people's wars. And today we're fighting on the U.S. side in the struggle to dominate the people of the world. And we are repeating, and this is my contribution, we are repeating a pattern which was established in 1899, the first time we went bounding off to South Africa. So don't trust me on this. Please get a copy of the book. I just marked it down. I don't want to send it back to Victoria on WestJet. But the book shows that in every war, there are recurring factors that come up that should give us as Canadians pause about what we just did and whether it was in our interest to do that. But we never have that conversation. And when the next call comes, we just go. And so that pattern is repeating. We never have the conversation, we just go, and we need to have that conversation today more than ever. And I'm going to cover this in just at the end of the talk, but we need to have that conversation, and it cannot just be a conversation among progressives. That conversation has got to expand. So that was part one of the message, the story of Canada's wars from 1899. Part two of the message that I preached all over Canada as far as anybody who would invite me last year was that Trudeau the Elder was wrong about the elephant. He said, we've got this big elephant in the south of us, and when it rolls over or does something, then it's a big problem for us, and we got to accommodate that. No, we don't. Canada can get free of the U.S. military, and I would add, get free also in matters of the environment and matters of the economy. And it's urgent that we do that. But there has never, the bright side of that is that there's never been a better opportunity than now for Canada to begin to get free of the U.S. And developments in the U.S. have both enhanced the urgency that Canada get free of the U.S. And enhanced the opportunity to achieve it. I am a Canadian. I have been a Canadian citizen since 2005. I have been here since 2000. I am thankful to be here. I used to be an American. Yes, I'm a recovering American. I think I'm pretty well recovered. And I do want to say that I do not use hyperbole and invective casually. I do not use it in the book. You will see that. But I have to tell you now that the United States at the moment is a cruel, corrupt, racist police state. The most dangerous nation on the planet. And I listened last night, and I was very interested. I hope the gentleman is here today, because I was very glad he was here. Someone last night raised a question about the Korean. Why doesn't the peace movement give Donald Trump credit for the meeting in Singapore? And it was a fair question. If you recall, Christine said she agreed with him, and Raven very, very appropriately pointed out the broader picture of Trump's. And my answer that came to my mind is, one, we don't honor that, whether we should or we shouldn't, because we see how much harm is being done by this man and his toadies to so many people. And that makes it a little hard for us to give him credit. And the other part is that the man has the attention span of a gnat. He's not thinking about Korea. He hadn't thought about Korea in months. So, but I'm very glad that the question was asked. It was a fair question. And I understand that facing the reality about the United States is not easy for Canadians. We know that there are millions of decent, compassionate people in the U.S. I have family there, and I love them. But the time has come to forget about how we think things used to be between Canada and the U.S. Put aside your thoughts of all those nice people that own the RV park in Scottsdale. It's time for a different mindset. Generalities, by definition, don't include everyone. But the most accurate working characterization of the Americans today is ignorant, arrogant, and selfish. And for Canadians, it's ignorant, blissfully ignorant. But if we can help Canadians awaken, they will see that the rest of the world has a growing awareness that we can and should disassociate ourselves from the U.S. and move forward without the Americans to end war, to establish peace, and to save the planet. And it can't be achieved tomorrow, but the first steps can be taken tomorrow to disassociate ourselves. Why do we continue to join in war-making with the corrupt regime to the south? One of those recurring factors in the book helps to explain that just a bit, and that is a factor I call longing for recognition. We Canadians are real interested in our place on the world stage. We even have a myth about it, that we came of age at an obscure place called Vimy Ridge in an obscure battle in a war that was nonsense in the first place. But we're really concerned about our place on the world stage. And that factor of longing for recognition is absolutely off the chart when it comes to Canadian military hierarchy. The Canadian generals, as opposed to ordinary soldiers, are envious to a fault of their American counterparts and all the wonderful toys that they have to play with. They are not interested in peace or peacekeeping. General Rick Hillier reminded us years ago that the purpose of the Canadian forces is to kill people. And a lot of Canadians seem to forget that. But the real danger is that these generals exert undue influence on the government. They are perverting the very idea of peacekeeping and using that term, using the twisting of the language, as we heard from Professor last night, to draw Canada into fighting on the side of the U.S. in civil wars around the world. And recent Canadian commitments to Mali are a perfect example of that. There is, if Tamara will help me here, the generals know that there's an old formula used to draw us into U.S. military adventures, always has been and will be today. And there isn't time to explain this formula to you right now, but I hope you will ask me about it in the Q&A session. But one of the elements of that formula is a propaganda campaign. And an example is the propaganda spin on why we were in Afghanistan. And I've asked Tamara, as part of her presentation, to take one of my slides. This is the Afghanistan Memorial in Victoria, British Columbia. So when your ordinary Canadian wants to know why we were in Afghanistan, the answer is very simple. We were there to help children and build schools and hospitals and little girls. It's a lovely memorial, and it's also outright propaganda, which is part 3 of the formula that I hope you'll ask me about. So it's important to Canadian human security also that we divest from every aspect of U.S. wars, including the phony global war on terror. Now, that war is phony, but that doesn't mean that it isn't dangerous, and not just dangerous to them. As David Swanson reminds us, that war is a never-ending war, and the battlefield is everywhere. You and I are on the battlefield today, here and now, on the side of the U.S. as far as the world is concerned. And so if our side kills civilians, then fair is fair, right? Why should civilians not be killed on the other side? That's the way the game goes. So at present, Canadians are not prime targets, but the more we get drawn in, the more our own human security is involved. And finally, I want to close with this, and it may be the very most important thing I have to say. We want to grow the peace movement, And I can't tell you how glad I am to see World Beyond War coming into Canada. But we cannot succeed with peace people alone. We have to find ways to talk to our fellow Canadians who are too busy at present with other things. We got to find ways to relate. I really hope we can explore this also in the Q&A and the rest of this weekend. And I'm going to close with 4 suggestions about how to do that that I learned as part of my travels promoting the book across Canada last year. And the first thing I want to do is I want each of you to commit right now, and I want a show of hands. I want you to commit to speaking at least once a week about Canada and war to a fellow Canadian who is not part of a peace group or a progressive church. Who will do that? Who will talk to their neighbors who are too busy taking the kids to hockey practice to worry about this stuff? Thank you, thank you. And talk to the people who didn't raise their hands. All right. What I've learned is that, for what it's worth, all right, all right. Hey, good, good. That is excellent. And don't start with telling them about the peace issue. Start with something else. It can be anything. It can be music. It can be the kids' education. It can be hockey. Eventually, there is a common ground that you will get to that will allow you to raise something that they will be concerned about in matters of Canadian wars and peace. That's point 1. Point number 2, and this is my trial lawyer experience speaking as well as my peace activism. Rely in these conversations mostly on questions, not statements. And that is very important because it's clear that you know more than they know about these matters. But it's also clear that you're not going to change their mind by bombarding them with facts and truth. So, and it's also, they've been getting a free ride. We don't ask them questions. And so they don't have to think and justify what they are supporting. So use questions and not statements. For example, so help me understand what it is that makes it worthwhile to kill civilians. Let's talk about that. You might ask your neighbor about that. There was a great example recently here in Toronto after the Danforth shootings. Why does a Toronto city dweller need a handgun? See, that's not preaching, that's trial practice. That's drawing out in the kind of conversation that we need to have. Third, do not allow diversion to hypotheticals and generalities. Don't allow the conversation to go to what about. I can't count the number of times that I have asked something specific on these issues, and the response was, well, would you have fought Hitler? Joan Baez taught me personally, and I'm thankful for it, that hypothetical questions get hypothetical answers. There's something real going on, and that's what needs to be talked about. So continue asking questions about the specific action that you are concerned with, and there are many concerns, and just tell these folks, we'll get around to talking about are you against all wars later. But right now, let's talk about something specific. And finally, never let a misinformed comment pass. That is an invitation to try out the approaches I've outlined above. Now, my tour revealed this need and produced these suggestions, but I do not begin to have the answers on all the critical matters that we need to talk about with Canadians, or the way to talk about. So let's talk more today about how to reach them, how to reach beyond this group. And let's commit today also to Canadian independence from U.S. wars. I will close with something that I remember very well, and I bet a bunch of you do too, and maybe you can just join me and I'll have a little enthusiasm going into the rest of the day after my long trip. I lived in a tool shed in the middle of the Contra War against the people of Nicaragua. I lived in a tool shed provided by the family of Alejandro Picado. And she said, she taught me what you all know. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. You know the name of that. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. The people united will never be defeated. Wonderful. United will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. Et pour les gens de Canada, c'est vrai aussi. Allons.
Thanks for getting us started this morning, and certainly thinking about how to talk to people is going to be an important learning from today. So I'm now just going to briefly introduce Tamara Lorincz. She says, look in the book for her information, and certainly you should. But I also want you to know that she is on the board of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace with me. Love being on the board with her. She is so knowledgeable. I learn so much from Tamara all the time. And she was a co-founding member of the Vancouver Island Peace and Disarmament Network in 2016. So I'll just share those tidbits with you, but please do read about her. Tamara is one of our Canadian treasures. So welcome, Tamara, please.
Good morning, everyone. I am very grateful to World Beyond War for bringing us all together this weekend. So in my, it's going ahead. In my presentation this morning, I'm going to be talking about some current developments in Canadian foreign policy and Canadian defense policy. I'm also going to be talking about the state of Canadian war making and Canadian military spending, and I'll close with some ideas about what we can do. But I'm going to begin in the United States. This is a picture of John Bolton on September 10th. Bolton, who is the U.S. National Security Advisor, gave a speech to the Federalist Society, a conservative think tank in Washington. And in his speech, he said this about the International Criminal Court, and I'd like to read part of his speech here. The United States will not cooperate with the ICC. We will provide no assistance to the ICC. We will certainly not join the ICC. We will ban its judges and prosecutors from entering the United States. We will sanction their funds in the US financial system, and we will prosecute them in the US criminal system. We will do the same for any company or for any state that assists with an ICC investigation of Americans. Well, what prompted this reaction? In November last year, the chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, Fatou Bensouda, made a formal request to the judges of the ICC to launch an investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity in Afghanistan. For the last decade, the ICC has been gathering claims from Afghans in all 34 provinces of the country, claims for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by US and NATO forces in their country since the start of the war. Over 1 million claims have been filed, claims for rape, assault, murder, torture. Now, some of you are aware that the United States has signed but has not ratified the Rome Statute. Canada has signed the Rome Statute and is a party to the International Criminal Court. The ICC is supported by 123 countries, and the ICC is considered the court of last resort. This potential criminal investigation applies to Canada. Some of you might be aware that in 2009, a senior diplomat and intelligence officer, Richard Colvin, gave testimony in a parliamentary hearing that Canada is complicit in war crimes, in torture with Afghan detainees. Now, the Conservative Harper government refused to hold a national inquiry, and this Trudeau Liberal government has also refused to hold a national inquiry. But we must hold our governments to account, and this ICC investigation will be very important. So, because Canada is refusing to pursue an ICC, a national inquiry into Canada's role in torture in Afghanistan, a Canadian law professor at Osgoode Law School here in Toronto filed a submission to the ICC asking for the ICC to investigate Canada. His name is Craig Scott, and he is a former member of Parliament in the House of Commons. His submission to the ICC is available on the website. You can look at it online. There it is there. Now, last month, the Canadian media got wind of a report, an internal report from the Department of National Defense through the Freedom of Information Act that revealed that Canadian Special Forces have been withholding information about allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Canadian Special Forces in Afghanistan. So there are allegations that Canadian forces murdered people and that witnessed murder and didn't report it. So it is very important for the ICC to pursue a Canada. Now you might be thinking to yourself, but Tamara, this is not all bad news. Maybe you've heard that that this week in the Canadian news, 2 days ago, a member of Parliament, a Liberal who is the representative for Etobicoke, Boris Rizanowski, he introduced a private member's bill to establish an ambassador for women, peace, and security in Canada. And then yesterday, our Global Affairs Minister is hosting a 2-day historic meeting of female foreign ministers around the world in Montreal for 2 days. And what's at the top of their agenda? Well, to talk about feminist foreign policy. It is very important for us to consider the supposed progress that Canada is making on women, peace, and security in a broader context. So let's start with last year. Our Global Affairs Minister stood up in the House of Commons and she presented Canada's new foreign policy. And she said Canada needs hard power to support the global order. And if you notice by the arrow there, she also called for an increase in defense spending. Now this is our Foreign Affairs Minister, right? And this is from her speech in the House of Commons, and I'll just read this quote. To put it plainly, Canadian diplomacy and development sometimes requires the backing of hard power. We will make the necessary investments in our military to not only redress years of neglect and underfunding, but also to place the Canadian Armed Forces on a new footing with the equipment, training, resources, and consistent, predictable funding they need to do their difficult, dangerous, and important work. Well, the very next day in the House of Commons, our Minister of National Defense, Harjit Sajjan, stood up and announced Canada's new defense policy. It's called Strong, Secure, and Engaged. And let me give you a few details from this new defense policy. We are going to massively increase military spending to $32 billion by 2026. We're going to be building more warships, buying more fighter jets, buying new armed drones and attack helicopters. We're going to increase the number of special forces that we have. We are going to recruit more soldiers, and we're going to especially target women and First Nations and minorities. Now, this defense policy, if you read it, is much worse than Harper's 2008 Canada Defense Strategy. In the Canada's new defense policy as well, we are going to be spending $553 billion on the military over the next 20 years to maintain high-level warfighting. It is very important for you to know that there was not one member of Parliament, not any party in this country, including the Green Party or the NDP, that denounced and spoke out about our new foreign policy and our new defense policy. Let's look a little bit at Canadian military spending. So I prepared this graph showing spending by the federal government on the Department of National Defense and the Department of Environment and Climate Change over the last 20 years. You can see in 1997, military spending was $8 billion, and in 2016, it reached $28 billion, and under the new defense policy, by 2026, it will go to $32 billion. By contrast, spending for environment and climate change has flatlined at $1.5 billion for the last 20 years, even though we know that the climate crisis and the ecological crisis is much, much worse. Now, a few months after the federal government announced its new foreign policy and new defense policy, Canada released its 5-year National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. And a quote from that document says, Canada's new defense policy, strong, secure, and engaged, with its focus on gender equality and diversity, is also part of this feminist approach. So you should be aware that in Canada, feminism equals militarism. And then 3 months ago, the federal government released its new defense investment plan. This gives more detail about the capital investment into new equipment by the defense policy. Now, this is a plan that the weapons manufacturers in this country have been lobbying very hard for the last few years. So they are very excited by this new plan. Now, what is Canada doing with all of this money and with all of this equipment? Well, we are not doing peacekeeping. We haven't been doing peacekeeping seriously in the last 20 years. Canada right now is ranked 61st. We have only 173 soldiers wearing blue helmets. Most of the soldiers are right now in Mali, working alongside France in a neo-colonial project in their former colony. Now, this is the state of Canadian war making. Canada is working with Canada is working with the Lima Group to overthrow the Maduro government in Venezuela, just like we did in Haiti in 2004. We're selling arms to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, and Bahrain. We are literally fueling the conflict and the refugee crisis in Syria and in Iraq. We have Canadian soldiers along the border of Russia, provoking Russia in Latvia, Poland, and the Ukraine. We, earlier this year, the Canadian Navy was partnering with the US AFRICOM on naval exercise off the coast of Africa, and we've got special forces across Africa in the Middle East. So what can we do? Well, we need to push for the ICC to have a war crimes investigation in Afghanistan against Canada and the United States and other NATO forces. We need to denounce our new foreign policy and our defense policy. We cannot call it feminist at all. We need to call for a reduction in military spending. And finally, I'd like to make a plug for another organization that I'm involved in. We need to work to keep space for peace. And this is just the poster that I thought you might like from the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. No Space Force, we need to keep space for peace. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tamara. Okay, now as we turn to our next speaker, I'd like just to take a moment to remind people of we're on traditional Indigenous land here this morning. It's part of our Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations that we acknowledge that and recognize the history. We're talking about Canada and the US. These are colonial constructs of states that are on land that has been occupied from time immemorial. And we're about to learn a little bit more about the history and wisdom that Indigenous people have to share with us, the power of that. So as we start, I'm just going to say, here on Turtle Island, and here in this particular part of the world, we have land that's been occupied by the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, Petun First Nations, and more recently the Mississauga of the New Credit. And I want to say that I've learned so much from the wisdom of Indigenous people over the many decades that I've had the opportunity to have that connection. So I'm very much looking forward to our next speaker. That's Maracle. And Lee is an award-winning author and the titles of the books are in your notes, and I'll just mention two. My Home as I Remember, an anthology. She's co-editor of that and co-editor of Telling It, Women and Language Across Culture. I'm really looking forward to reading some of these works. And Lee was born in North Vancouver and is a member of the Stalo Nation. And she's a mother of 4 and grandmother of 7. And she recently received the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for her work promoting writing among Aboriginal youth, and has received 3 teaching awards. She's here at the University of Toronto. And will you please welcome Lee Maracle? Thank you.
I don't work very well with technology, so I don't bring any. Can you hear me? Good. Good morning. Ani, Sego, Ashrael, Tanse. That's the 4 of the biggest languages in this land. I want to say that the title of my talk is Canada and War and Indigenous Rights. But the only reason that we have rights is Canada thinks it actually owns this piece of land. And in the recent court ruling in British Columbia, it only owns outright reservations. I want you to think about that for just a second. Thank God we have some goodwill from the Stalo people, because we haven't removed anybody since that ruling 6 years ago. That's not our way of being. I am the great-great-granddaughter of the Princess of Peace. And that means something to you. I was born 68 years ago. And when I was 2.5, I was given a club with sharp spikes and a rope. And I was told to meet my grandfather. I was 2.5, actually. I could talk. And he was coming in from the ocean. And I would say to him, I come here with a war club and a feast bowl. What's your pleasure? That's the Stalo fundamental way for a very long time. And then the Princess of Peace had a conversation with some Canadians who came across from Ontario. You don't even know how to say your province's name. This is actually Takaranto, and Ganata. You know what Ganata means? Village. No, Ganata means village. Yeah, so you're villagers. Yeah, that's a good name. It's kind of neutral. Yeah, you're not claiming this land. You're just saying you're a villager. Living here. I think that's good. Anyway, they came around and talked to my people, and she said to them, what are your basic laws? And they said, recited the 10 Commandments, and the first one, she just said, well, God didn't talk to us. The second one, I'm not sure if this is the right order of the 10 Commandments, was about coveting the neighbor's wife. She said, I can't stop that even amongst the women. And the other one was about no adultery. She said, oh, for goodness sake, we have multiple wives and husbands. Sometimes we have a husband and a wife, No, we can't do anything about that. Then they got to thou shalt not steal. And she said, that's the pastime of our youth. Never mind that. So then they get to thou shalt not kill. And she says, well, we agreed not to kill the Klaklik people, so I guess we can agree not to kill you. But remember, we know you went to war in Africa. So we will not kill for you. We will not kill for you. And to that end, I work at the University of Toronto, and I got the Order of Canada. I guess they think I'm a loyal Canadian. I don't know. But they invited me to do the November 11th talk. And I said, I don't think you want me to say something on November 11th. I am the great-great-granddaughter of the Princess of Peace, and we said we would not kill for you, and we haven't. So if I get up there and speak, I will talk about that. That the killing is what we do here in the West best. 110,000 dead Afghans, 6,000 dead Americans. I don't know how many dead Canadians, but I am not going to get up and laud and feel grievous toward the dead soldiers who killed that many people. Can't do it. We weren't always peaceful, the Stalo people weren't always peaceful. We were warring on the West Coast for about 1,000 years. And we know what the effects of that war is. First of all, warring nations experience family violence. 1/3 of the people in this province are immersed in family violence. Half of Americans are immersed in family violence. The soldiers come back and are not right in their minds. And there's no addressing the lack of rightness of the mind of those soldiers. So the Americans can hardly wait for the next war to deploy those guys again. And then it goes on and on. Since Korea, there hasn't been let up in America. There was a little bit of a let up under Pearson here with the peacekeeping that Canadians engaged in. But then Harper hijacked the country and ended that. I don't support that. I was mentioning to Tamara that my mother joined the Voice of Women sometime in 1960. And my first experience with them, I was 16. And I was at a conference, and there was rumor that Joan Baez was going to be there, and people walked up to me and asked me for my autograph. Of course, I'm cheeky. I said, I'd be happy to give it to you, but I think you'll be surprised at my name. Anyway, they found out I was not Joan Baez quite quickly. But I have always stood for peace, like my ancestors. And I think it takes a tremendous effort. And here's the effort that the Stalo people deployed when we decided to give up warring with Indigenous people on the West Coast, the Haida Lachayot, the Tibetian, Gexan, and Ohlone from the United States. It took raising our children from the cradle to the grave in peace. That means practicing absolute goodwill to the babies. So we hang our babies on the wall in a what do they call those? Cradle boards, yeah? We hang our babies on the wall, and when you come in the house, you address the child first. We believe that we are old people when we come here. We come from the spirit world, dead elders, and then we arrive here, and we're here to get our feet on the ground, and it takes a child 5 years to do that. And when we say respect your elders, we mean me and the babies. And the babies first, because they're older. If a child is raised in peace, they will be peaceful. The second thing is they need appropriate food. And as you know, 90% of the stuff in the supermarket, I wouldn't feed to a dog. Matter of fact, if you read the vitamin list on the dog food, we should probably be eating that than some of what's called food. But also, we don't have adequate food. We're producing weapons instead of food. We're producing bombs instead of food. We're producing drones instead of food. And then the food that we're producing, we're adulterating. So peace to earth. Peace to plants. Peace to fish. Peace to animals. peace to the sky. Stop bombing the moon. Peace to her. Peace to everything. These are the words that should come before all else. That's what we call them. I honor all beings. And we teach our children that. We stopped teaching our children about war a long time ago. But I will tell you this, I'm a Stalo. And I'll have a little story about Chief Dan George, who's my grandfather, probably one of the most peaceful men I know. But it was 1956, and the Indian agent came and said he was going to appropriate our reservation because there weren't enough people on it. And he ran into the bedroom and he came out with his hunting rifle. And he said, "Over my dead body." And of course the guy left. And my grandmother looked at him and she put the gun down, the point of it. She said, "You do not take charge of the peace in this home. You are in charge of the peace a long way from this home." Because in my culture, the women are in charge of the village. That would be Canada now. I like that name. And so my grandfather had to apologize to my grandmother for usurping her authority. It is not up to him. Likewise with the Confederacy people out here, it is them, the women, that determine whether men go to war. Now, in the United States, I don't know about here, but about 40% of the population lives pretty close or at the poverty line or below. I think it's about the same here. I know that there's 200,000 immigrants in this city below the poverty line. We invited everybody here and then we starved them until they're loyal. Starve them into loyalty. The British system of doing things. It got transplanted here and it works pretty good. Worked with the Irish, worked with the immigrants, and they're trying to make it work with us, but my family just kicked ass with Kinder Morgan. And we're going to continue to do that. And we did it with peace, and we did it with 25,000 Canadian allies. Shoulder to shoulder. I learned that from the peace movement long time ago. I think I was 10. We're going to march toward peace, shoulder to shoulder. And so we need to consider how we're going to engage each other. You know, Canada has a trust account for my folks. They're always talking about how poor we are. There's $3 trillion in those trust accounts. Not one penny has been given to us. It's been taken off our reserves for 150 years, actually longer. The woman admitted it was 210. And they haven't accounted for a single cent. They don't know who actually owns that money, which, you know, whether it's my reserve or this reserve or that reserve or anything like that. But they're not talking to my chiefs and my relatives about how they're going to disperse this, because it's not Canada's. It came off our land, and we're supposed to use it to live. And they haven't yet done it, but the thing that the Trudeau government did was set up a meeting to talk about accounting for it. Because for some reason they don't dare spend it without knowing who's who. Yeah, and all they have to do is turn it over to the AFN, figure it out. Figure out what you're going to do with it. Well, the Six Nations have a nice philosophy. All heads are the same height, divided up. That's what they say, and I think that's a good way to go. I'm a very small reserve. There's only 510 people in my community. I probably wouldn't get very much of it, but I'm in Vancouver. So we are not poor in Vancouver. What's that say, a minute? Okay. I'll take my minute. I'm going to take my minute by singing. Whoa-hee-na, highway-hee-na, hi-ho-yo-yo, hi-ho-yo-yo, highway. Hichima, chichima-chakus, highway, highway. Whoa-hee-na, highway-hee-na, hi-ho-yo-yo, Takaranto, highway. I'm so glad to meet you here on this highway to Takaranto. Thank you.
I would like to say thank you, Miigwech, to Lee, and to all our panelists. And so we will have a question period for discussion, and please keep your questions brief, or if it's a comment, keep it brief. We will have mic runners. We've got Mary Ellen and Charlotte. Mary Ellen is where? Do you want to come on this side? And Charlotte, do you want to take that side? And just as we transition into the questions, I would like to just add a little wisdom from the some of the mentors that we've had in Voice of Women for Peace over the years. Ursula Franklin told us that peace is not just the absence of war, it's the presence of justice and the absence of fear. So very important to think about what we mean when we're talking about peace and peace building. And Anne Goodman, one of our teachers as well, pointed out to us that the values in the home are nurturing values. We expect homes to be nurturing, inclusive, supportive places, safe for people, no violence. And if there is violence in the home, that's considered a crime. And yet, when we look at international world affairs outside the home, we don't necessarily translate those values as the mainstream. But that is what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring those values to that public sphere. And your stories, Lee, you just shared with us about the peacemaking in your communities is an example of how we can do that and take those values forward. Okay, so we have time for a few comments. Questions? Sorry, thank you.
This is on. Okay, I resonated, do you go by Bill, William?
Yes.
Bill? On the importance of trying to create dialogue with people who don't agree with us. And I know there's been a lot of interest, especially in the United States, in people like me who didn't vote for Trump to create some dialogue with people who did vote for Trump and try to come to some understanding about that. And I also learned that people doing brain research have studied what happens in your brain when you are challenged, when a deeply held belief is challenged. And the same parts of the brain light up as if the person is experiencing physical pain. So it's something really important to remember when you're challenging someone's deeply held belief, even just by asking challenging questions, that they may be actually experiencing physical pain in being challenged in their thinking. That's what brought that to mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I work in the field of conflict resolution, and listening skills are so important that we give people space. People also need space to process, to think, to respond. And we don't want people to feel that they're in a box in a corner and threatened when we're talking to them. So that listening piece, which Bill was talking about and other panelists, so important. So I think we'll take another comment or question. Take yours. We'll take one here and then we're coming to your side. Okay. We'll do two over there after. Okay.
Kia ora, another fantastic panel, thank you. Liz Remiswell from New Zealand, and I'd just like to make a quick comment which is relating to our experience in New Zealand, which is very, very similar to Canada and many other countries in the world as far as participating in these wars. As far as the inquiry into what's happening in Afghanistan, we campaigned to get an inquiry and successfully last year. And we had a change of government. The former government refused to, but the next government agreed to it. So that is happening now. And of course, the military has a budget of millions of dollars to, to defend what's going to happen, but it's happening. Also, some journalists wrote a couple of books. One very famous, wonderful journalist, Nikki Hager, wrote a book about Afghanistan called Other People's Wars. And then he and another journalist, John Stevenson, wrote a book called Hit and Run about what's happening about what is happening in Afghanistan. So my question is there any global organization which is bringing together all these atrocities committed by the different armies, for this campaign in Afghanistan? And that could be, because like there is a New Zealand lawyer, Deborah Manning, who's doing a legal case on behalf of the Afghan villagers family were killed by our soldiers. Is there any sort of global movement to build a case? Thank you.
Would any of the panelists like to respond? Tamara, did you want to?
I don't know of a global movement, but maybe that's something that we could launch here. But I do know, like, for instance, in, I think it was January 2015, British lawyers sent a massive dossier to the ICC to investigate Britain for war crimes committed in Afghanistan. And so, it's happening it's happening nationally, and the Center for Constitutional Rights has some very good material, and they've been really pushing to get the ICC to investigate the United States. So we just really have to hold our governments to account, and we're not going to make any progress if we don't look back and be held responsible. Oh, absolutely. All of the coalition forces, all of them. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We're going to the other side with two questions, and then we'll see.
Ken Stone, Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, Hamilton, Ontario. It's about 50 kilometers west of here. I have a comment and a question to Tamara and Bill. My comment is this. I'm grateful to Tamara for being the first, to my knowledge, at this conference to raise the issue of Canada's illegal war making in Syria. This is a big question because in less than a month, there may be a major confrontation between the nuclear powers over Syria, which might result in a wider war in the Middle East or even a world war. And Canada's role in Syria has been a very dirty one over the last 7.5 years. Canada has organized the Western effort for the proxy war in Syria. Canada has contributed to the proxy armies. Canada has funded the White Helmets, a fraudulent organization embedded in al-Nusra.
Go to the question.
Okay, the question is this. What can we do as Canadians and U.S. citizens to help get Canada and the U.S. to ratchet down this war and get out of Syria to provide for peace for those people? Thank you.
You will take a second from that side, Charlotte, please.
Oh, right here.
Charlotte.
Should I ask the question now? Hi. Do I really have to stand up? I'm going to strangle myself with this thing. Hi, my name is Robert McBride from LEAP Montreal. First of all, for Lee, we've won the Kinder Morgan battle, at least provisionally. It's, for the Americans who don't know about Kinder Morgan, we can talk to you about this after. It's a huge victory. I wanted to actually address Bill. We have two children, 31 and 37, and they think that we're weirdos and left-wing fanatics because of our positions. And they think that, in my case, they think that I'm clearly ridiculous. How do we engage family members without creating tensions in our family? Because this extends not only to our boys, but also to my sister, to various other relatives. And it's much more important for me that I have good relations with my children than that I fight over politics. And so I want to ask you about that.
Well, okay. I do want to say to you, obviously just check with me later. I have a two-part answer that solves all the problems. But I do want to say that things, as far as the resistance is concerned, and I really appreciated this first comment because I've seen those studies too, and it's very important to realize that when talking to other people. But I don't want to be overly pessimistic in this. There is an underlying area of concern there. The military in Victoria has something that Tamara actually alerted me to. They have a Be a Soldier for a Day campaign. And high school students are brought in and they're shown all the weapons and it's a recruitment procedure. Well, they did this at an armory in Victoria, and I put on the old uniform, went out in the parking lot, and I had a handout. Said, well, once you're in there, here's a couple of questions maybe you might want to ask the people who are showing you all this stuff. And the point of me recalling this story is that these young kids were coming through the parking lot with their parents. And when I handed that out, one of the things that I took away from it was that the parents really began to be receptive. Now, I know that's a very small sample, but I think there is an underlying concern that is shared by Canadians. We just have to figure out a way to reach it. And as I said, I gave you my 4 suggestions from traveling the country last year trying to talk to ordinary Canadians, and I would be more than happy to hear other techniques or other ways that we might engage. And I do, let me quickly take this opportunity because I had a chance to speak to some Americans this morning. And I want to say we are so glad you're here. When I say your country, my former country, is a corrupt, racist police state, I'm obviously not talking about you. I'm not talking about my sister. I'm not talking about my other sister in Wilmington, but it's just the realization that this is truth. And that's what that truth means to us as Canadians, is that we have to start talking to people about how to separate ourselves. And we can do it. I was talking with Margaret Rao this morning, my beloved host, about how we hear, well, if we do, Canada is going to suffer. NAFTA here, there, where Canada will be hurt. Well, so what? Think about, there was Canada before NAFTA. There will be Canada after NAFTA. If you talk about suffering, think about what the U.S. is doing to Iran or in other countries you're pointed out. Let's not get so worried about the fact that we may have to go through a rough patch in this separation from the U.S. And I think we can find ways to talk to our fellow Canadians about that.
Can I just respond quickly to Syria?
Yes.
Thank you very much for making that comment. How many people are aware of U.S. Operation Inherent Resolve? Put your hands up. Okay, no, not very many people. So since 2014, the United States has been leading this massive coalition called Operation Inherent Resolve. 30 countries are involved, and it's effectively a bombing campaign of Syria and Iraq since, for the last 4 years. Canada is involved. Canada's contribution to this effort is called Operation Impact. So if you go to the Canadian Department of National Defense website, you can see Operation Impact. So as part of Operation Impact, Canada was bombing Syria and Iraq from 2014 to February of 2016. We are no longer doing the bombing with the United States and coalition forces, but we are doing all of the refueling. So Canada has delivered 70 million pounds of fuel to this bombing campaign. Now think about this, folks. For the last 4 years, there have been 30,000 bombs dropped on Syria and Iraq. That's 700 bombs a month. 700 bombs a month. The other thing to mention too is that we have no idea. Canada isn't recording the number of civilians killed. But Air Wars is trying to investigate how many civilian deaths there have been. So they're estimating about 3,000 people, I believe, have been killed. But you can go to the Air Wars website. It's a coalition of journalists trying to provide some independent reporting of Operation Inherent Resolve. The other thing to point out is that all military emissions in overseas operations are all exempted from national greenhouse gas reporting and from reduction targets. Military emissions are exempted. And so this bombing campaign in Syria and Iraq is contributing to the climate crisis, and our governments aren't being held accountable for military emissions. This is something that I'm doing in my research at the Balsillie School for International Affairs, and I would love to make contact with people who are investigating the climate and environmental impacts of the military. Thanks.
Now, one other thing that Tamara taught me about this issue is that this fuel we supply, and she can correct me with the numbers because she gave them to me, this fuel that we supply is not just regular jet fuel, it's toxic. It's highly toxic, and it's what, $9 a liter?
Oh, it's very expensive.
Yeah, so we're paying if you're worried about your gas prices here, we're paying $9 a liter to bomb, to help others bomb people with toxic fuel.
I'm going to address the fellow's question about talking to your family. When I started doing work as an activist in the Native community, it was to close a residential school down, and no one, not my community or nor any white people or the church, was in favor of that. But you know, I have to say I contributed to turning that ship around. It took me only 50 years. But we have multiplied. And we took down Kinder Morgan because of that. All these things are related. So I think this gentleman over here talked about asking questions. We call that Wizokatatawin in Anishinaabe, the wampum process, probably from your Choctaw relatives. And in my country, Tsonaquit, the way in which we explore to find something cherished and hidden. Do not think because you have a point of view that you necessarily know something more than your relatives. If you go there with humble hat in hand to have a discussion, you will be forced to learn more and they will come around. Betcha.
So one last question, and then we'll be wrapping up. Okay.
Thank you very much. My name's Judy Berlin. I live in Montreal, and I was glad to see Bill wearing a white poppy. And I don't know if everyone here knows about the white poppy campaign, which started in England by a group of women. After World War I, these women had all lost loved ones in that senseless slaughter. And it continues in various parts of the world sporadically. It's very vigorous in Quebec, where I live. And if anyone's interested in the white poppy is to commemorate all victims of war, the many civilians, many more civilians than combatants, actually. 200 million civilians killed in 20th century wars, non-combatants killed. And it commemorates all those victims and is against war and militarism. So if anyone would like a white poppy, I've got them. Secondly, very quickly, Tamara's comment about all our military exports, and she listed some of them, but I have a friend who runs the Coalition to Oppose the Arms Trade in Ottawa who says by far the worst is the fact that 85 to 90% of Canadian military goods exported go to the U.S., and can you think of a worse country to be selling armaments to? Thirdly, listening skills that Lynn spoke about. Listen for what you don't hear. I find that very useful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Judy. Okay, so Tamara would like to respond.
Can I just quickly respond to that? It's even worse, Judy. The Canadian government will not provide any details about Canada's arms exports to the United States because of a defense agreement with the US about 60 years ago. So we cannot get any details. They can keep this information from the public. About every 2 years, Global Affairs will release their arms export report. So the last one was in 2016, and in that report, you can see some of the countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, that Canada sells arms to, but you cannot get any detail about our arms exports to the United States. And finally, I just want to say that I have 30 copies of the one-page overview from the public accounts about how Canada spends its money, our revenues, and our expenses. So you can see military spending compared to environmental spending and spending on Northern and Indigenous affairs. And you can also have the graph and my contact information. So I have 30 copies if you'd like to pick that up. Thanks.
Thank you. It's now time to thank our panel. Fantastic presentations to get us started this morning. So thank you. I would just like to briefly mention that it's really important for us to learn as we're going to do today. It's very important for us to be organized, to work together, to be allies, as Lee Maracle was talking about the Kinder Morton victory, which traditional leadership, Indigenous leadership, and allies. And tomorrow afternoon, we have a whole day tomorrow of building our relationships and our work together. And after the peace walk, you go to Friend's house. It's on the yellow page. I'll tell you about that, and we're going to be strategizing about Canadian peace movement. Steve Staples of Ceasefire and some other groups, and Voice of Women is hosting. So pick up the yellow page for more information, and an interesting presentation on Wednesday about empathy and threat perception regarding Korea and the South China Sea. So pick up a green piece of paper if you want the details on that one next Wednesday. 4:30 after the walk. Yes. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, 15-minute break.